Well, welcome everyone. In today's video, we're actually going to be covering something I use quite a bit, which is Terraform. And for those who don't know what Terraform is, it's basically something that will allow you to create, connect to the cloud, to a public cloud infrastructure, and actually create resources, or in some cases, deploy apps and services that you'll need to actually create your infrastructure, or in this case, anything that's relating to Azure. Specifically, we're going to be creating all the Azure resources needed to actually get started with machine learning on Azure. So let's kind of go over the basics that you'll need. The prerequisites are pretty simple. So I have this GitHub here available for everyone to use. It's actually going to be the example that we're going to be going over. And basically you'll need to get started is actually have Terraform installed on your PC or your Mac or your Linux machine. And you'll need to download it and get started and make sure you could actually start using it. And you'll also need an Azure account. In this case, I already have my Azure account here. And what we're actually going to be using is to deploy to that. So let's actually go to Azure. Let's go to the Azure portal here. And what we're actually going to be creating in Terraform is a couple things. We're going to be creating a resource group. And as you can see, there's no resource groups here. We're going to create a resource group. And within that resource group, we're going to be creating the Azure Machine Learning Workspace. And basically everything that you need to get started with your Azure Machine Learning Workspace. You'll need a couple other resources. You'll need a storage account, app service, and Azure Key Vault. And there's probably another one I'm forgetting, but basically you'll need to have those installed. And then for the final one that you'll need is you'll need the Azure CLI. So if you don't have it, you can download it here, depending on what operating system you're using. And basically what the Azure CLI is it's a command line interface that allows you to communicate to the Azure resources or the Azure shell itself to actually create services and resources as you'll need. And so with that being said, why would you actually want to, let's say, use Terraform, right? What is the purpose of Terraform? The purpose of Terraform is to repackage a lot of the resources and apps and services that you'll need basically in Azure or any other sort of cloud service to allow you to recreate these very seamlessly and have a standard, if you will. So let's imagine you're an enterprise, let's say you're an enterprise company who has several different workspaces from, let's say, development to QA to then production, right? The reason you'll want to use Terraform is because when you're, let's say, deploying these resources for a group of data scientists or a data scientist to actually use, you want to make sure that the same resources that they're using in development to train their models and test things out and then to quality assure it in the QA environment, and then just before you go to production, you want all that to basically match up and be very reusable, right? Because if you had to redeploy this all from, let's say, the portal, this would become very repetitive very quickly, right? So let's just go over an example real quick. Let's say if you're going to be creating one, let's say the old-fashioned way through just the portal itself, right? Let's say you want to call this RG Dev ML Dev, let's say cost savings, right? And then you'll have to pick out the, let's say, for example, a region for it, for this resource group. Let's go to next. You'll have to create different tags, which goes into some other sort of infrastructure. And basically you'll have to create this, so on. And then once you have it created, you'll have to create the Azure Machine Learning Workspace, right? So then we'll show machine learning. Once you have this, you'll have to start configuring all the information depending on the needs of the data scientist or the data engineer or other sort of person that's going to be using it. You'll have to give it a specific name. So ML space dev cost savings. And then you'll have to give it a specific region that you want it to go in. You'll have to give it a specific storage account to make it work. You'll need to give it a Azure Key Vault, you'll need to give it App Insights. And as you can see, a lot of this is being renamed on its own, right? And then depending if it's going to be public or private, you'll have to configure that. Depending on the encryption, you'll have to figure all that out. Identity format, so on and so forth. You'll need to tag it, and then you'll have to create it. And as you can see, this is just for one resource, right? And as you can see, this is going to become very repetitive if you have to do this for, let's say, dev, QA, and then production, right? Not too bad if it's just those three environments. But let's say you want to scale this up to several different teams, right? Or several different groups of data scientists, data engineers using these workspaces, right? Maybe there's one for, let's say in this example, it's cost savings, right? For your company. Then there's another one that's for optimization. Maybe there's a specific model that you're building out, right? And as you can see, a lot of these are going to become very repetitive very quickly, right? So if you have, let's say, 10 different teams, each using 4 different models and each needing different environments, as you can see, that's going to be 5 times 4 times 3, and that's going to be starting adding up, and that's going to become, let's say, just on the fly, it's going to become 60 different workspaces on their own, right? And without getting too much into the weeds of how all this works, right? You'll have to be creating a lot of this repetitively, which is what you want to avoid, hence why you want to use Terraform, right? Just for this dev environment, it wasn't too difficult, but overall, you don't want to be doing this over and over again, right? Instead, what you want to do is actually have this already available and reusable for other people to use. So that's where Terraform comes in, is that you could actually create one resource, and as we go through our example, you could just rename it once or twice with different ways to rename it, and it's very easy for you to use. So let's actually delete this resource group here and start over. And let's get started with Terraform. All right. So let me delete this, and while that's being deleted, let's actually go to my GitHub, right? Or I mean, let's actually go through the Terraform code that we're actually going to be using, right? So when you're getting started with Terraform, you'll need a couple different things. Normally, you'll just need a main file. You'll need an output file if you want to make sure that you're outputting the right information out. You'll need the provider, and you'll need the variables. So let's kind of go over all that information. Since Terraform is a multi-cloud supporting infrastructure as code API, that means you could use the same code, at least with different nomenclatures. You could use Terraform to build out, let's say, AWS, Google, Heroku. You could use it to build out Azure in this example. And it makes it very simple and seamless to actually create this. And there's actually a lot of documentation from the cloud providers to actually make it very simple to deploy this information. So let's kind of go over what we will actually be outputting in this example. So we'll need the main file. The main file is basically where all your primary resources that you're going to be deploying will go, right? There's more cleaner ways to do this, but for simplicity's sakes, we're just going to be going over and deploying all our resources for this Azure Machine Learning Studio to get running, and we're going to deploy it just from the main file, right? And then from here, we're actually going to give it the private. Since we're going to be using Azure, that's what this provider TF file will actually do, is depending on which resources you're going to be deploying, you're going to be using those providers. And again, in this case, it's Azure. And then you're also going to have something called the variable file. The variable file is basically anything that you want to have renaming capabilities or information you want to feed into the model, you're going to input into this file, right? And it'll make sense in just a second. So let's go to the main file, right? The easiest way to get started with it is just creating a very simple resource group first, right? So once you have all that, you'll want to type in. So in order to make sure that Terraform is working, what you want to do is type in Terraform, helps if you spell it right, at the PowerShell or your CLI or whatever terminal you're going to be using, right? So type in terminal or Terraform, and you should get something like this if it's installed properly, right? So in this case, let's check out what version of Terraform I'm using. And as you can see, it says you could check out the version just by typing in Terraform -version. So let's see, it looks like I'm using Terraform 1.98 on Windows. Okay, perfect. So that's what I want to do. Now, for simplicity's sake, when you're creating Terraform code, there's basically 3 steps you want to run. There's Terraform init, which initiates and checks all your Terraform code to see if it's valid. And then you're going to run, once it's validating all that, you're going to actually do something Terraform plan. The Terraform plan is actually going to solidify and create a state file. Basically what that means is all this information of the resources or that you're going to be deploying is going to be created into a solidified state, which can't be changed until you re-update the plan later. So once you have that and you're satisfied with everything, you're going to do something called Terraform apply to actually deploy these resources. So let's kind of go over the Terraform code here, right? The easiest way to check out what Terraform documentation is by checking what you want to run, right? So in this case, I just want to create an Azure resource. That's going to be a resource group for Azure, and it's going to be named basically, let's say for simplicity's sake, we could keep it something like ML RG. Let's give it a fake name and call it Eddie's Coupons.co, right? So it's just a fake company, it's a fake name. And usually when you're deploying resources, you also want to give it the environment that you're going to be creating. In this case, since it's a development one, we're just going to call it development. And usually when you're deploying a resource group, you also want to give it a location, right? In this case, there's a couple different locations. So let's actually go over Azure. All right, so I usually like to go, because I live in the West Coast, I usually like to go with West US, right? So as you can see, these will be values you could feed it in, right? But let's say you want to change this information. Let's say in some cases you may want to deploy to the West US, and in some cases you want to deploy to the East US, right? What's an easy way to change all that, right? As you can see, what you'll need when you actually create other resources, let's actually jump down to this example. You'll need an application insight app to actually create a workspace. As you can see, you'll need to give it a name as well. You'll also need to give it a location, and you'll need to give it a resource group information as well, right? If you had to type all this information out, it would get very repetitive and very quick, right? And that's where variables come in, right? So in this case, if we jump down to the variable Terraform snippet here, I already have one. So I already have a Azure Terraform name that we're going to give it. We're going to give it a resource location. That way I don't have to completely type this all out. If I just change it here, you could actually reference these variables in the code as well by just typing in var dot and then the resource name of that variable you're actually creating, right? So in this case, we're going to use the var.resource group location variable name that I created. And then here, instead of typing all of this out here, I'm actually going to cut this and paste it here. So there we go. I'm going to save that. And now let's actually reference it here. So that's going to be the name. All right, great. And that's actually going to make it easier for us to actually reuse these variables and these names over and over again. Why do you need to reuse this? Is because the same scenario that we went over here to create this resource, this resource group, you have to give different sub-resources. Let's say in this case, Azure Machine Learning Workspace, you have to give it a resource group to associate it with, but you also have to give it a location, you have to give it a name, and you have to link certain resources to that application, that workspace, to actually make it work. So in this case, if we go down to the Machine Learning Workspace here, we'll need to give it a couple of information. So if we actually go back, I don't think that, yeah, the resource is gone. So if we actually go and create a Azure machine learning workspace, it's going to ask for a bit of information. It's going to ask for a resource group, right? It's going to ask for a name for the workspace. It's going to ask for a region where you want to actually deploy this. It's going to have a storage account, key value, or key vault value, application. And as you can see here in Terraform, when you're actually going to be deploying our particular code with Terraform, it's actually going to be asking for the same information. So in this case, the name of the workspace, right? It's going to be asking for a location, right? It's going to ask for a resource group name. It's going to ask for the application insight ID. It's going to ask for the key vault. And the reason that Terraform is very powerful is every time you deploy one resource in your code, you could actually reference it later. So in this case, if we actually take a look at the way I'm actually calling it here, is Azure resource group, which we already created on top here. And we're actually going to be referencing its location. So if we go back here, the location of this resource group is actually, the location is actually going to be the variable already initiated here in the variables TF folder, which makes it very easy and simple to re-reference a lot of this code. So let's jump back down. Same idea is going to apply. Resource group name, since we're referencing it in our code, it's going to be re-referenced and it's going to be calling that information here, similar to what we need here. And again, if we use the application information or the application insight app, it needs the ID. It's going to need the same information from the key vault and the storage account. So now if we go back to the application insight, it's the same thing. We're going to give that application a name. And then here, again, we're going to be referencing our Azure resource group, and we're going to be referencing its location. Same idea here. We're going to be referencing the name, and then we're going to give it a value application type, which is just web. Don't worry too much about the details. Just know that when you're creating a lot of these resources, it's going to be very simple to reuse them later on. So let's actually just go through this example. So now I would go over each of these and verify if it's correct, right? So if you need to create, let's say, an Azure App Insight, I usually just check and see what is needed. So I usually type in Terraform, Azure App Insight. When you go to Terraform, the official Terraform documentation, it actually has examples here for you as well, right? And you usually at the bottom will actually give you what the arguments are referencing. Say, I don't know what application type is. Well, if I go to application type, there's a couple different ones that will be referenced. It's basically either a iOS type, a Java type, a mobile center type, a Node.js, so on and so forth. In this case, because we're just creating a simple one for, let's say, Azure ML, it's a web type for it, right? Now let's go down to the next one and let's go over Key Vault. Same idea, right? So let's actually Google this. Let's actually, since we have this, since we're going to be creating a Azure Key Vault, there's a couple resources that we will need, or a couple key commands that we'll have to give it in order to actually have that information displayed, right? So normally I go to the information that's required and kind of read through that. We'll need the name of the workspace, pretty self-explanatory, or the name of the key vault that we're going to give it, pretty self-explanatory. Then it says location. Well, since we're going to be deploying a lot of this, again, in the same location, we're referencing that variable, which makes it very easy for us to use and keep reusing, right? It's going to ask for a resource group name. It's going to ask for a SKU, and then it's going to ask for a tenant ID. Great, we have all that information here. Great, now let's go down to the final resource that is needed to actually create an Azure Machine Learning Workspace, which is a storage account. All right, so from here, let's actually do the same thing. All right, simple example here again. Let's go down to the argument references. As we can see, it's going to require a name, right? It's going to require a resource group name as well, which again, we're referencing. And then it's going to ask for a location. And then the account type is optional. The tier account type is required. What is that? So if you actually look into the Azure account tiers type, let's actually do that. So using the documentation, you can actually find out what these tier types are, right? As you need, you could just kind of read through these and it could specify what the tier types are, right? In our case, we're just going to be creating a simple blob storage, which is a standard account. And then we're going to be wanting a very particular replication type, which is GRS, which stands for globally redundant storage, which basically means that our storage account will actually be available for all over the location, all over the globe, if we need to have it for that, right? There's different ones that we could have as well. In our case, I'm just going to keep it simple because these are kind of just the default arguments, right? All right, so once we have that, now let's actually look at the final one. All of these resources are actually needed to actually create an Azure Machine Learning workspace. So let's actually go and type that out. Terraform Azure Machine Learning. And let's go to here. All right, and as you can see, there's a couple things that will be required, right? So let's go down. All right, so you'll need a name of a workspace, of course. You'll need the resource group, the location, the app insight ID, which we already created, and we have that information, which we could reference. We'll need a key vault ID, which we reference as well. And then we'll need a storage account ID. Great. Now that we actually created all those, and this is the interesting thing about Terraform, is that it creates resources based on when you're actually declaring them in the code. So if, let's say, I declare this resource group down here in the last, Terraform would execute this by creating an application insight first, but it's going to have an issue because there is no resource group just yet, right? So it's actually going to throw out an error. So let's actually not delete that and move that back to the top. Okay, so let's kind of go through the code first, step by step, what it's going to do. So first it's going to do is connect to the Azure CLI configuration. So the easiest way you could do that, at least from this example, is you actually have to do AZ login, and then it's going to prompt you to log into your Azure portal and your account, and then it's going to grab that tenant ID for you. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Then the next step it's going to do is it's actually going to create that resource group, which is MLRG, just stands for Machine Learning Resource Group, shorthand. And then it's going to create that application insight, which I just named app in, put an S here, ML, right? And then from here, let's go to Azure Key Vault, and it's going to create the Azure Key Vault ML. We're just keeping it shorthand. And this is the interesting thing about a storage account. Storage accounts, every time you create one, you actually have to have a globally unique name. So even if it has been created in the past, that means that if it's been created once, it can't be available again. So I'm actually just going to timestamp this with the date here. And today is 11/02/2024. All right, let's timestamp it with that. And then we're gonna go down to our Azure Machine Learning workspace. So if you're actually using VS Code and you downloaded Terraform, the extension, it'll actually let you know when there's an error. In this case right here, as you can see, the application insight is labeled in white. Why is that? Well, if we go back here to our application insight, it previously had an S in it, but it did not have an S in it, and I actually just gave it app_ins ML as the name. We're going to be referencing that object to create that resource. It is now reusable because that is a Terraform object for us to use. So if we actually go down and go down here, and we're going to change this, we're actually going to type in app ins. Now instead of the just in, it's ins, and we're going to reference the ID. Great. All that information is provided. Now let's actually go to the first step of deploying this. So let's actually save this. Let's clear this out, have a clean workspace. All right, so once you're satisfied with your Terraform code, let's actually deploy this right here. So let's actually call Terraform here in the terminal. Init. And what Terraform's actually going to do is basically create all the backend information needed to create Terraform code. For that later, it could actually push these Terraform objects that are resources that it's going to deploy to your cloud provider, in this case, Azure, right? Great. And if you have any bugs or any naming issues anywhere in the code, if you run Terraform in it, in most cases, it's going to fail if there's any bug or any typos anywhere. So great. Or if it's referencing anything that hasn't been created in Terraform. Great. So that's working. So let's actually type in Terraform plan. Terraform plan is now going to lock in our state, and it's actually going to be getting ready to create all that information for us. So let's give it a moment. And your output, if you can see it here, let me stretch this guy out, will actually be resources it's going to create. In this case, let's go all the way up. So Terraform is actually going to create the resource group, which it's going to create, and then it's going to create the application insight. It's going to create the Azure resource, Azure ML workspace. Great. And it looks like if you have pluses everywhere, in most cases, it should be fine. So this is where Terraform is going to be very helpful, right? So Terraform plan says it's going to add 5 new resources, change 0, and destroy none. This will all make sense in a second. So let's actually deploy this. So Terraform apply. And now it's actually going to deploy these resources to our tenant ID. All right, let's go down. All right, so now it's asking us if we want to deploy this. We're going to say yes. All right, and once you say yes, it's going to take a moment to create this. And if you have your Azure portal available, once it's creating this, you'll actually be able to see this in the portal. So let's go home and let's go to our resource groups. As you can see, let's go up here. It's going to be following that name of the resource group that we created. Great. And as you can see, it's going to be creating all these resources in that resource group for us. So if we click on it, it looks like it's already created the app insights, and it's going to create the rest of the app. So let's let this run for a bit, and then we'll come back once it's finished, and we'll keep going. So if your code was successful, you should have something like this that says applied complete resources created. So let's actually go down here. Let's check out our resource group. So it doesn't look like much has happened, but we have all these resources created. We have the dev workspace, the key vault associated with this, the app insight, and the storage account, which is great because if we actually want to go to this, so let's actually go back one step. So let's actually go over the idea of this right here, right? So let's go over where you may want to reuse this Terraform code, right? So this is one for development, right? So let's say we want to create one for, let's say, production, right? Let's actually go to our variables and let's actually rename this information to MLRG coupon group. Instead of dev, let's go to production here. And let's say we want to change it because we noticed let's say our customers are asking for a lot of this information. Instead of the East Coast, let's go to the West US. So let's save that information. And wherever we see dev, let's actually change that to prod here. Change. Let's go down. Don't see anything else. All right, and let's remember that our workspace has to be unique. So let's change this. Okay, so now let's say we want to redeploy this information, but instead of the development environment, we want to redeploy this information to the production. So we're just going to rename a lot of this information to prod, and let's actually go and let's go to Terraform plan. Let's see. This is one of the nice things about Terraform is it will give you error messages when things are not properly named or aligned. Oh, make sure you save it because it will give you issues there. Great. So it looks like a couple things were renamed, and your Terraform will let you know when those informations are renamed. So let's actually go to, okay, let's test this out and see if we did everything correctly. And let's hit Terraform apply. And if we did everything correctly, it should redeploy the same resources put to a production environment that we have labeled as prod. So let's hit yes here. All right. So if you actually try to run that, you're actually going to encounter an error, which is actually going to be this state file error. So this is what I meant about Terraform being reproducible to an extent, right? So let's actually kind of go over the state file. The state file itself is actually, when you're deploying specific resources, it'll actually create those information for you to be redeployed. In this case, since we already had state files here, we actually have to delete them in order to actually redeploy this for production. Now, normally this is not really how you do it in production, but for the example, we're just going to do this. All right, let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of all the Terraform here. All right, so we'll only have this information. So let's actually rerun this. And this time, let's rerun it from the start Terraform. All right, let's do Terraform plan. It's going to generate new ones, and it should give us all the resources that we're going to be creating. Great. Let's make sure that this is, let's say, time 12. Just for fun. Terraform. Apply. Yes. And let's give it a minute to deploy that again. And if things are successful, let's go back to our resource groups. And we should see a production one being created alongside the dev one. And let's give it a bit, and it should create the prod resources for us. As we can see here, after we let it Terraform apply run for a while, it completed and created everything. So let's actually go here. And as we can see, we have the resource groups here, the one for dev, the one for prod. And if we go here for prod, we actually have a lot of those resources, not only deployed from the actual example from dev, but we have them now in production, ready and available for use. All right. Thanks again for sticking for this video. That was a soft introduction to Terraform. We're going to go in depth with this series and kind of go over more MLOps capabilities, but I wanted to make sure that people who understand Terraform had a basic understanding of it. And in the next video, we'll go into this similar example, but then we'll actually run code in a pipeline using GitHub. So stay tuned for that video. Until then, see you guys next time.